Hey guys, in today's video I want to talk about Breakpoint, the Netflix show that follows professional tennis players around at various tournaments. And for you guys that don't know, I already made a review of Breakpoint Part 1, which came out in January. And I was somewhat critical of the show, and some of the criticism still remains for Part 2. But I can tell you without the shadow of a doubt that I liked Breakpoint Part 2 a lot better than I liked Breakpoint Part 1. And also, since I made that first video in January, I've had some interesting experiences that made me like the show a lot better. For example, my dentist all of a sudden started talking to me about Breakpoint. And mind you, she never played tennis before and became a huge fan of the show. And every time I go to her now, we talk about the show Breakpoint. So this show has a tremendous amount of potential, and that's not the only person that I talked to that didn't play tennis that knew about the show Breakpoint. There's been several occasions of people getting into the game of tennis because of this show. So I'm a big supporter of Breakpoint. Now I'm going to tell you one quote from Taylor Fritz, who is one of the players that's featured in the show. And he said that as an American, people only care if you rank number 1 or if you win Grand Slam tournaments. Simply being in the top 10 is not enough. And I'm going to agree with that quote, except if you make it on Netflix. If this show can continue to get better and continue to attract more and more fans, similar to how the Formula 1 series performed, that's made by the same company, I believe. This show has a tremendous amount of potential of bringing tennis to a much wider audience. Now, the reason why I liked Part 2 over one, because I felt like they followed the characters more throughout the tournaments. One thing I didn't like about Part 1 is that they selected a tournament and then chose 2 players to follow around. And then they went to the next tournament and there was 2 separate players. I think a better idea would be to feature all players that are in the show during a specific season of the show and then follow each player at each individual tournament. For example, the biggest star of the show, like him or not, is Nick Kyrgios. And a big part of Kyrgios was his performance during the Australian Open in Part 1, where he won the doubles, and of course in Wimbledon, where he made the final. But I would have loved to see more of Kyrgios during the US Open, where he had an enormous chance to make it to the final. The draw was wide open for him. He had to beat Khachanov in the quarters, Ruud in the semis, and then Alcaraz in the final. And I think that was definitely a winnable tournament for Nick, and they showed a quick clip of him getting super angry in the locker room after losing to Khachanov. But I would have loved for the cameras to be there on how Nick felt by missing out on this huge opportunity. So again, I think it would be much better if the show featured all players at every tournament, because all players are at every big tournament. And then we get to see how the players are performing throughout the year, because here's the thing about any specific tennis season, there's a lot of ups and downs. Players go through a lot of momentum shifts, and these are interesting to watch. Now, speaking of Nick Kyrgios, I can tell you that my opinion on him has changed completely after watching Breakpoint Part 2. And this is not talked about a lot for some reason. And I'm not gonna get into any specifics, but Nick opened up about his mental struggles on tour. And he even talked about why he was wearing a sleeve. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, I highly recommend that you watch the Wimbledon episode in which Nick openly talks about his struggles. And I've known about this because Nick made a post on Instagram a while back. And for some reason, I didn't take this post seriously. And what he was talking about there was some very serious stuff, nothing to joke about. But hearing him talk about it on camera changed my mind completely and made me realize how difficult the sport of tennis is from the mental standpoint. And I think Breakpoint did a really good job showing the mental struggles of tennis players. It wasn't only Kyrgios, it was also Ayla Tomljanovic playing against Serena at the US Open. It was also Anett Kontaveit losing to Serena at the US Open. It was also Taylor Fritz at the Masters. You got an inside look on how much pressure these players are dealing with. And often the casual tennis fan will see this and interpret it as the players being babies and being weak. But I guess if you haven't played tennis at the competitive level, you don't understand the type of pressure that these professional players are dealing with. The pressure is enormous and it's very difficult to deal with. For all you guys that have competitive tennis experience, maybe you played in college, maybe you played in juniors, just think back to the times when you had a big match ahead or a big tournament ahead of you. and the type of pressure that you were experiencing. The day before, there's nothing else that you can think about except that match. And then the morning off, you're nervous. And then as the match gets closer, you get more and more nervous. And what differentiates tennis from other sports is that you're out there by yourself. You're gonna be tested on the court, and there's only two outcomes. You can either win or lose. And now you take this pressure that normal tennis players like myself experience, and you multiply it by 10,000, where these professional players who play at the top not only have to deal with pressure of the moment when they're in a stadium in front of a lot of people, they also have pressure from sponsors, they have pressure from their close circle of friends, they have pressure from their peers, in other words, the other players who are on tour. And most importantly, something that's more of a result of the modern world we live in, there's a tremendous amount of pressure on social media as well. So you cannot push aside a player and call them a baby when they talk about their mental health challenges. Watching Breakpoint Part 2 made me realize that often I judged Nick Kyrgios from afar without knowing a lot of details about his situation. And I can tell you that I'm never ever going to be critical of Nick Kyrgios again.